And I have the chat window. Why is my chat window not showing at the moment? Oh, because I'm doing the full screen share. But best, we're a small enough group that if you just want to unmute when you have a question, please just feel free to unmute and ask the question. Otherwise, of course, usual Zoom etiquette, please stay muted. So let me close this and start the slideshow. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk in a little bit of depth about how you can import flights into MyFlightbook. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit on this. And included in bulk importing will be exporting your data. That's a pretty straightforward process. This is my third at home, my sort of branding webinar in 3 weeks. If there are ideas that anyone has for other areas to go deep, I'd love to have those suggestions. If there's any specific questions about how to use other aspects of MyFlightbook, or want to go into other features, or get help with a particular problem you're having, I'm happy to do that, but let's take those offline, either in email, or I'm happy to set up a separate Zoom if that's easier for you. So the agenda is basically 3 key scenarios. Ab-initio, meaning you are starting typically from paper or some other non-electronic, I guess that is the only non-electronic source. I'll talk a little bit about importing from other electronic sources, other logbooks, scheduling programs, and CloudAhoy. And then I'll talk about bulk editing, which is importing from your own flights. And that gives you the ability to do round-trip bulk edits, which I think is unique to MyFlightbook. I'm not aware that any other logbook app supports that capability. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And this will be heavy on demos and light on PowerPoint. So to start off, the key thing here is that everything is done with CSV files. A CSV is a spreadsheet format, but it is also a text file. So you can see over here on the right, I have a sample 2-column, 3-row spreadsheet. Oh, sorry, 3-column, 3-row spreadsheet. And if you were to open, this is what it looks like in a spreadsheet program. And if you were to open that, save it as CSV and open it in a text editor, this is what it would look like. It would just, you could read it in a text editor. It's just each row of the text file corresponds to a row in the spreadsheet, and each column, the boundary is specified by a comma. In some parts of the world, it uses a semicolon instead of a comma, but the idea is that it's basically a text-based format for representing a simple spreadsheet table. And so what I'm looking for in the CSV file of your flights is the first row has to contain the names of the columns that you're importing. So this is things like the date of the flight and the aircraft that you're using and how much time you spent as a pilot in command. And I'll talk about what the columns are here in a few minutes. But the key thing here is I don't care what order they're in. They can be in absolutely any order, but they can't be blank and they can't be duplicate. So if you have an extra column that's useful for you to keep track of something and it's got some column name that you've made up, that's fine. I'll ignore it on import, but you can't use the same column name twice. And so sometimes, for example, a spreadsheet will think you have some ghost columns at the end or ghost rows at the bottom. Ghost rows aren't really a problem, but the ghost columns are. And so you want to delete those columns because those have blank and duplicate column names, basically empty. After that column, after that first row, which declares the columns, each row of the spreadsheet which corresponds to one row of the text file of the CSV, is an individual flight. And so obviously the data in that row corresponds field by field with the columns as declared above. So if the first column is your date column, then you want to make sure that the first piece of data in that row is the date of flight, and then a comma, and then the second column is the tail number if the second column is the tail number, and so forth. Obviously, you don't need to worry about the commas. Your spreadsheet program, Excel, Google Sheets, Numbers will handle the commas. You just want to make sure that things line up with the right data in the right columns. You'll use local conventions for dates and numbers. So here in the US, that's typically month, day, year, and we use a period as the decimal point. But in, say, France, you probably would be using day, month, year, and using a comma as the decimal point. And typically, your browser and your spreadsheet should be aligned. MyFlightbook will figure out your locale and use the correct settings on import. That said, it's not a bad idea to express dates using year, month, day format, because that's a universal format that works for any system. And so there are 3 ways to get a CSV file, and these correspond to the 3 key scenarios I'm talking about today. If you're starting Ab-initio, if you're starting from paper, you can create the spreadsheet by hand. And I'm happy to say I've also now got a partnership with AccuLog, which will provide transcription services and auditing services for you. And I've got a link to them on the website. So if you have a paper logbook, you can hire people to do it, or you can type it in yourself. And again, the key thing is just make sure that it's 1 flight per row and that all the data lines up with however you declare the columns above. If you're starting from another logbook, then you got to figure out how that logbook does an export. They all do in one form or another. Unfortunately, I can't provide the product support for how to find that export functionality, but once you do, you can get it into a CSV format. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Some logbook apps I can import directly. Some will need some massaging. And actually, simplest advice on that is to just try it. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the third way that you get a CSV file is you export it from MyFlightbook. So you're starting with your own flights. And you download that, and then you edit the resulting file, and then you re-import that, and so you can change multiple flights at a time by doing that. And so I think that is, let me just quickly go over how the import process works, and then I'll start diving into demos. So the first step is you upload the file and validate that it is conforming. So this is making sure that you're not uploading it in Excel's native format or in Numbers native format, and that it has, each row has the same number of data as there are columns. If there are 20 columns, there better be 20 items of data in each row. There are some of the other logbook programs don't export CSV correctly, unfortunately, and there can be errors with that. And I'll talk about those. But that's the first step, and that's a pretty automatic process. Then you'll review any aircraft that are missing, and this step is kind of unique to MyFlightbook, and it's because MyFlightbook is very, very tied to the aircraft for each flight. The aircraft is what tells you the model of aircraft used for the flight, which is what tells you if it was turbine, if it was multi-engine, if it was a helicopter, if it was a complex aircraft or a tail dragger. So getting that right is really important. Then you can preview your flights. And the key thing about this is that no flights have been imported or edited until after preview. And so this is great because you can go in and make sure everything is just right and see what it'll look like before you actually touch any of your data. And then you press the big button that will do the import. And then optionally, after you do the import, you may have some flights that didn't go into your logbook because they had errors. Those go into your pending flights, and then you may want to review them and accept them into your logbook. Now I'm going to get to the demo. So let me switch over to Firefox, And I just want to make sure everyone can see my browser screen here. Someone say yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. To all of the importing is done by going to the Logbook tab. It's all on the website. You can't do this directly in the mobile apps. And you go to import on the Logbook tab. And so the first screen here is telling you basically what I just said, which is that you have to have a CSV file. It should look something kind of like this. I have a starting template that you can use. And so if I click on this and I open that in Excel, there we go. You can see here's a simple template. I've got 18 rows in this template, and it's got fields like date, tail number, model, approaches, whether you did any holds, and so forth and so on. And the idea is you could just start typing into this and save it and import. MyFlightbook can import an awful lot more rows than this. In fact, it can also import a lot fewer. The three columns that can do a lot more columns. The three columns that are required are the date. Every flight has to have a date. Every flight has to have a tail number. And I can talk a little bit about things like ground instruction, but they have to have a tail number and they have to have a total flight time. Every other column is optional. And to see what columns are available, you can click here on description of the columns. I've already got that open in another tab here. And you can see here are the main columns that the system knows about. So date, tail number, total flight time that I just described. Most of these are in that starting template, but not all of them. And then as we scroll down here, there are close to 700 additional columns that you can import. And these are exactly the set of what I refer to as flight properties that you can add to a flight. Everything from acting PIC time down to number of zero visibility takeoffs. And for each of these, it tells you what the name of the property is, whether it's a number or it's a yes/no property, or if it's text, it's free-form text, and a description of what the property describes. And so it's a good place if you want to know, how do I record night takeoffs? You can look for takeoffs and go through here, and you can find here takeoffs bungee, Carto. There's a whole bunch of them here, and there's takeoffs night down here for how to record that. Now, it's really important to note that the column header has to be exactly, including spaces, what's in here. Capitalization, I don't think makes a difference, but the spacing does. So in this case, it's takeoff space hyphen space night. And if you just cut and paste from here, that will work. True false properties, you use yes or no. If it's a date property, you want to use it in your local date format. If it's a time property or a currency property, basically a decimal property, you want to use your locale's decimal. Let me, then there's a couple links here as well. You can read more tips in the FAQ, which I'm going to cover most of today. And there's a blog post, again, covering a lot of what I've got today. So let me open up a simple sheet that I've already put together. There we go. Basically follows the same format as the template I just described, except I've put in a few sample flights. So I put them in with the date. I've specified a model column. You do not need to provide a model because the tail number provides that in general. But I have it here because if the aircraft with the tail number is not in the system yet, then providing a model helps with the import process because it helps define the aircraft. And I'll show how that works here in just a moment. And in particular, notice that I've got four aircraft here, sorry, that have actual tail numbers, but I've got a sim here and I've got a pound sign. So sim means this was time in a simulator, and so here the model is useful because it says I was simulating a Boeing 737-800. And pound is a MyFlightbook specific shortcut for an anonymous aircraft, where it was, it was a mix of tail numbers, or I don't remember what the tail numbers were. And so here I put in Piper Cherokee. I think it was mostly Cherokee time. And I'm using that for a catch-up flight here, which is what I put into the comments. And so you can see I have large numbers for my catch-up flight. And I put in a long cross country here from Seattle to New York, JFK. You notice actually I left the cross country field blank here, and there are some things I can fill in automatically on import, and I'm gonna show how that works. So let me actually show what it's like to import this file. Oh, there's one other thing I do want to show here so that there is no confusion. I have one flight that deliberately has an error in it. And so you're going to see an error on import, and that isn't because my demo failed. It's because I'm showing what happens when there is a demo. I do want to do a shout out to AccuLog, who can do paper logbook transcription. All right. So this page is an overview of the import process, and I click to proceed to upload. I get a page where I can drop my file. So if I go over here and I drag that file, before I do that, I wanted to check the box here. See how it says, try to autofill fields like night and cross country if not already provided. So that cross country flight in my import that didn't have any cross country filled in, I want to see if it'll fill that in for me. So I'm going to drag that here. And it's reading the file. And what it's doing right now is it's looking at the aircraft in the tail number column. And so one of those aircraft, November 40 Foxtrot Golf, is one that I fly all the time. It is already in the system, so it just added that to my account. Second one that I added was November 135 Sierra Sierra, and I said that it was a C-182. But there are two versions of 135 Sierra Sierra in the system. There's one that's in the system as a GROB, and there's another one that's in the system as a 182, because sometimes tail numbers do get reassigned. And in fact, if I click on the tail number here, it brings me over to the FAA website, where I can see that, in fact, the most recent assignment for this aircraft was as a GROB. But I want it as a 182. So I'm going to click Add Existing Aircraft next to the 182 version. All right, next aircraft was the anonymous one that I did. And it wasn't able to handle Piper Cherokee. It might have done a better job with PA-28 or something like that, but that's fine. If I type in Piper Cherokee, actually there are a bunch of different Cherokee models here from which I can choose. Let me say, oh, look, it could have been a 140 or it could have been a 141. I'll say it was a 141, and I'm gonna add that. Then I put in November 941 Victor Victor, and I said it was a C-150. That doesn't match anything in the system. That is a new aircraft to the system. I can just click Create Aircraft, because you can see that it did match that one reasonably well. Or I can click the pencil and type C-150, and maybe I want to say that specifically that was an Echo model, but the commuter might have been fine, and I can create that. And then there's the sim. And I specified that that was a Boeing 737-800 using the ICAO code. And so it matched that one perfectly, which is great. But sims can be either uncertified, like Microsoft Flight Simulator, which means I don't want to count it towards any currency. It can be an FTD, where you can log the approaches. It can be a full flight simulator, where you can log both approaches and landings for 6157B. A currency, or it can be an ATD. Up until a couple of years ago, these distinctions mattered a bunch for instrument currency, but the FAA simplified 6157C, so it doesn't matter as much, but you try and get it right anyhow. So in this case, I'm going to say that this was a full flight simulator, and I'm going to add. All right, all my aircraft are in, and I'm going to click Next. And it's going to preview my flights. Now, you see the error there, and that was, I warned you that you were going to see that. But there are a few things on this page I want to show. Most important one is if you look at this green plus button, that means a new flight is going to be added to your logbook. And it's really important that you realize that, because if you import the same data twice, you're going to see the green pluses twice, and you're going to get duplicate flights. I don't do duplicate detection based on the content of the flight because it's not reliable. And I'll explain how I do duplicate detection if you're importing existing flights, if you're doing a bulk edit, but I'll talk about that later. Here's that long cross country from SeaTac to New York. And lo and behold, because I checked that box, it filled in the cross country time as well. Now, I didn't specify things like a departure time and an end time in the file, but if I had, and if any of that flight time involved on the Great Circle path, time where the horizon, where the sun was more than 6 degrees below the horizon, then it would have filled in nighttime as well. And it can fill in a few other things based on, the more data that you provide, the more it can fill in. All right, so let's talk about the errors. You get a summary of the errors up here, and then you actually see the errors in context down below. And it's showing you the actual row from the CSV file, as well as how it interpreted the error, because sometimes the error is a syntax error in the CSV if there's bad CSV. And sometimes it's just, it's a more semantic error. In this case, it's a semantic error. I don't do very many semantic checks on your flights, but one of the ones that I do perform is I verify that if you logged night landings, that you actually logged some night flight. And so here I logged 2 night landings, but I didn't log any night flight. And so that's considered an error. Now, I can go and upload a new file, or just go back a step if I need to, if I want, and fix that and re-import and make sure everything is right. And that's a great way to go. Right now, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm just going to click import anyhow. And what it's telling me here is some of the flights had errors, and that's fine. And it's telling me that the flights that had errors will be put into my pending flights, not into my logbook. And so if I click OK, indeed, 5 flights that didn't have errors went into my logbook. One flight had errors, and so it went into my pending flights. I can click here to view the flights in my logbook, and I'm actually going to go look at the pending flights. Pending flights can be found in the logbook under Logbook tab under pending flights, or I can just click here. Here's my flight. And the idea is that pending flights are any flight that should not yet be in your logbook. And the 2 main reasons that you might do this are it's a flight in the future, for example, an upcoming flight from a flight scheduling program, or a flight that has errors. Maybe the tail number couldn't be resolved, or it has night landings without night flight. And so here I can just come in, open up the flight. I'm just going to throw in 0.1, just some non-zero amount of night flight. Click Add Flight. Now it has no errors, so clicking Add Flight worked. There are no flights waiting for my review. And if I click on the Logbook tab, I can see the 6 flights that I imported. So that is basic Ab-initio importing into my flight book. Let me pause for a moment and pull up the chat box, make sure. Are there any questions? If people want to just chat me a question or unmute, you can ask a question, or else I'll continue with the demo.
I just wanted to verify, and I think you said it, that when you put in a tail number, you said it was checking the system, it's going back to the FAA registry?
No, it is not going to the FAA registry. That is a great question. All of the aircraft in the system are crowdsourced from pilots like yourself.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons I don't go to the FAA system. One is that the FAA, performance. Another is the FAA doesn't always have all the historical data. Third is that they don't have a machine consumable format. The layout is hard to parse and to map. Another is that I've probably only about half of the aircraft in the system are US registered aircraft. A lot of them are from other countries that don't even have electronic systems. But a lot of times finally, a lot of times the FAA system is actually not quite as precise as pilots want it to be. A great example is I have an awful lot of C-172s in the system, and a lot of them are 172 Sierras. And the FAA website is pretty good about distinguishing a Sierra from a vanilla 172. But a lot of the pilots flying the Sierras want to distinguish between the G1000 factory 172s and the not G1000 172Ss. And the FAA data doesn't get that granular. Or they may have upgraded an aircraft, glass panel, or they have their aircraft on floats half of the year and on wheels part of the year, or they have a vanity tail number that they took from one aircraft to another. And it works a lot better to just have it be crowdsourced data, which is what you saw me do with the 150 as I imported them. Okay, back to slides. So I do want to dive in a little bit briefly on SIMs and anonymous aircraft. So I showed in my import that you can just use the placeholder SIM or pound for a SIM or for an anonymous aircraft. But it's actually better and less ambiguous if you use a full tail number. So all SIMs on my Flightbook begin with SIM, and I chose SIM partly because it's mnemonic and partly because that doesn't conflict with any country's registration prefixes. It turns out to be a nice coincidence there. So the SIM works during the import process because you have a model number. But if you fly multiple SIMs with multiple models and then you import these in batches, you're going to have to do that again. It's not a bad idea to get the unambiguous tail number that it ultimately gets assigned to. In fact, you can see in my thing, I said SIM and said it was a B737-800, and that ultimately got mapped to SIM B737-89. So it's a system assigned tail number. And you can do this by going into the aircraft tab, and you go add an aircraft, and you type Boeing 737-900, let's say. Great, here's the 900. And if I now say training device, and I specify what kind of training device, you can see the tail number to use down here. You can see as I switch, the FTD gets a different tail number than the full flight sim, which is different from the ATD. And if you use that tail number in your import, then it's all unambiguous. The registration, I talked about this in a separate talk, but the registration of the actual sim, you can put into the comments of the field, or there's a property you can use for it. But you only have one aircraft to represent a sim of a given model and of a given simulator level. Going anonymous is basically the exact same process, but instead you check this radio button here, and where you say it's a real aircraft, but it's anonymous. And you see it gets a tail number that begins with pound and a bunch of digits after it. And that just says this is an anonymous Boeing 737-900. But the pound or the SIM approach tends to work pretty well, so you don't generally need to do this. Sometimes you don't have a specific aircraft, and so not only do you want it to be anonymous, but maybe it wasn't, in my example, I used a Piper Cherokee, but maybe I have a line for all of my primary training, and it was a mix of Cherokees and 150s and 152s and 172s. For that, the system has a bunch of what are called generic aircraft. And so for those, use the model generic. And if I type in generic, so generic is a known pseudo manufacturer in the system. And you can see that I have, if I type in generic ASEL, I have a generic single engine land, a generic complex high performance, and so forth. Or I can have a generic helicopter. Or I can use generic ground, for example, for a time that I'm not actually flying and it's not in a specific aircraft. And so I strongly encourage people to use that rather than making up models or making up tail numbers. And the system knows about generic, so it won't let you create an actual registered flying machine. So you can't do an N-numbered generic. All right. So let's talk a little bit about importing from other logbooks. So the key thing is you need to be able to export your data from the other logbook into a CSV file. And pretty much all of them can do it. A few of them you have to do sort of a screen scrape. I think CrewTrack is one of those. But you can do it with ForeFlight. You can do it with Log10 Pro. And a bunch of these, MyFlightbook actually knows their layout, knows their column names, and can do the translation so that it should be a fairly seamless process. So if I go over here, I have an example of a ForeFlight spreadsheet, and they have an interesting layout where they have a table of aircraft, and then they have the actual flights below that, and their first row isn't their column name. So there's all kinds of idiosyncrasies about their layout. Okay, my goal is not to complain about ForeFlight's layout, but rather to demonstrate that if I go to upload and I drag and drop that file, it imports. Now, I glossed over this before, but you notice how here it says notes about file being imported, click to show. If I click that, it gives me some details about the file. So this file was identified as being from ForeFlight and was converted. I can even download the converted file if I want to see it in my FlightBook format. And here it's saying it found 52 columns, two rows, 2 flights, and all the rows and had the right number of columns. So when I talked earlier about validating your CSV, even if the CSV file didn't get converted, sometimes some of these exports won't do the right thing with line breaks. And so if it's supposed to have 25 columns, there'll be a flight where it'll have 12 columns on one row and then the remaining 13 columns on the next row. MyFlightbook can fix that up and it'll tell you what it did here if you want. It's buried under the click to show because it's a little bit geeky. But I just wanted to show that this is where you can see how the conversion happened and you can preview it. And sometimes there'll be errors but you can see them before anything gets imported. And so if you're not sure if things are going to be imported correctly, my first advice is give it a try. 80% of it could be imported correctly. And I have a large dictionary of commonly used names for a lot of these columns. And so I can use that. So in my FlightBook parlance, you just have a single column that is your route of flight, because I can figure out that the first airport in your route is your from airport and the last airport is your to airport. So there's no need to break that out. But other systems use a separate from and to column. And so MyFlightbook will figure that out on import. So again, just sort of try things there. So let me give a little demo here. I just showed how to do import from ForeFlight. I'm not going to do import from a bunch of other things, but I do want to show an interesting one here, which is if I go into preferences and scroll down, there's a Cloud Ahoy option. If any of you are CFIs or students and use Cloud Ahoy to debrief your, oh no, I can't demonstrate this. Oh, and I think I know why. Let me switch to, why you never make changes to your to your demo at the last minute. I'm using my developer machine rather than the live site, and the things work a little bit differently on the developer machine. So if you use CloudAhoy, you can import directly from CloudAhoy, and I might skip that part of the demo here. The reason was because CloudAhoy doesn't work with one of my development machines, but it is set up to work with my other development machine. All right, why don't I continue? I can come back to that. So let me talk about bulk update. Bulk update means you're going to do a round trip. You did your import and you realize that you didn't log all the cross-country time that you wanted to log or something like that. And obviously, the most important thing is you do not want to get duplicate flights when you re-import. You want to get update the flights that are already in your account. So the first thing that you do here, let me switch back over to the machine I was using here, is you go to the Download tab. And this is how you export from MyFlightbook. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of different options. But the key one here is to do a CSV file download. And I'm going to open that. And here we go. And you can see this is now a little bit more involved than it was when I did my first demo. It's the same flights, the same dates, the same tail numbers. But you can see, most important of all, there's a new column here called Flight ID. And these numbers here don't mean anything to you. These are the database ID of the flight when it was inserted in the database. So you do not assign this, I do. And this is what I use to match up a flight when you're re-importing your flights. So let me show a few other things that are in here. There's a model column that you may have had before, but now this is set to things that should resolve unambiguously. I add an ICAO model column. Here's the tail number, and you'll notice the SIM and the anonymous aircraft have become fully fledged tail numbers, and it has the display tail numbers. So I don't show this to you by default for the anonymous one. I show PA 28141 in parentheses to say, yeah, this was a Piper PA 28. I also have the database ID of the aircraft. That's useful if you have two versions of the same aircraft in your account. Generally, you don't want to muck with this. But like if you have an aircraft that is on wheels part of the year and on floats part of the year, but has the same tail number, it's in your system twice. And this is how on re-import you can avoid any ambiguity there. There are a bunch of columns here that are for you. I don't read these on re-import, but if you want to do analysis in Excel, category class, that I know the category class from the model of the aircraft, so I don't need that on import. Then here are a bunch of the fields that you had before, and then there are additional fields that you didn't specify, perhaps, or fields like complex and retract and tail wheel that are, again, for your information and information about signing the flights and any additional properties that you use. So the most important thing is do not muck with the flight ID column and do not delete any columns. If you delete a column, then the data in that column will be deleted when you re-import. So you don't want to do that. All right, we come back over to PowerPoint. It is, however, a good practice to delete any rows that you're not changing. You'll get better performance, and it avoids any unintended edits. Deleting a row does not delete a flight on the server on re-import. It just says it just removes it from the set of flights that you are editing. So when you re-upload the file, I just look at what flights are in the file. Those are the only ones that are going to be uploaded. So let me finish the demo here. Let me delete some rows because I'm not gonna edit those rows, and I'm gonna edit one row and leave one row untouched. Let's say I spent 0.3 hours in IMC and half an hour under the hood with my buddy, and I was actually, well, I have a comment here about how this was $100 hamburgers. Well, we split the cost, so those were $50 hamburgers, let's just say. I'm making edits for the sake of making edits. One thing I should point out, here's a couple of the read-only fields. You can use hour minute format if you want. I advise against it because the spreadsheets try to convert that to a time of day rather than a quantity of time. And so it's generally a bad idea. You'll notice these are in separate columns that have separate names, so these won't get confused with the PIC column that I read. These don't get read on Reimport. The only things that get read on import are the columns that are in this big long table of columns. So if it's not in here, it won't get reimported. All right, so I'm going to save this file with my changes. I'm only uploading 2, so I'm going to go back to import flights, proceed to upload. Go find that would be my downloads tab. Here is that it? I think that's the file. Yeah, that's the one. I'm going to drag it up here. All my aircraft should be okay because these are all existing flights, so great. And in fact, click to show, and again, 52 columns, two rows, so all is good. So I'm going to go next. Now, the key things on this page. First is you want to see the blue circle. That means that you're updating an existing flight. So notice this one has a blue circle and this one has a blue circle. The second thing is that for any flight that's being edited, I show you precisely what changes you're making. So here I added half an hour of IMC time. I added 0.3 hours of sim time, and I modified the comments from a $100 hamburger to a $50 hamburger. And so you can see exactly what changed. In fact, on the second flight, I made no changes, and you can see that there are no edits. And so if I click import, it will update the flights. That's all there is really to importing. It's exactly to bulk editing. It's exactly the same as the import process. You just start with an export from the system, and you want to see that circle. And then you don't want to delete any columns or edit the flight ID column, because the flight ID column is what matches up to your existing flights. All right, my other development machine has come up, so I can do the Cloud Ahoy demo I was going to do. So I'm going to say authorize my Flightbook to work with Cloud Ahoy. So that takes me over to the Cloud Ahoy website, where it asks for permission for my Flightbook to access my Cloud Ahoy account. And I'm going to say yes. Done. Now I have authorized my Flightbook to work with Cloud Ahoy. So if I now go to the import screen, there's now a Cloud Ahoy option down here on the bottom. And if I say import flights from Cloud Ahoy, it'll ask me what date range. That's mostly a performance thing and an avoiding duplicates thing. I can leave these blank, and so I will. I'll just say import for all dates of my Cloud Ahoy flights. And it just pulls them straight into pending flights. And it does that for a few reasons. It can be, there can be errors or ambiguities or things that you need to clean up. But one of the things to notice here is that look at how all of these comments are underlined and are hyperlinked, I should say. That's because as part of the import process, Cloud Ahoy provides links to not only the full flight, but also to each of the maneuvers within the flight. And I can click on each maneuver and it'll take me to Cloud Ahoy, which will load the flight and show me that maneuver in context. So again, for flight training, I think that's actually a pretty cool feature that it can do. Oh, I don't know why that's giving me that. Well, anyhow, I wanted to show how to import from Cloud Ahoy. So there are a few other tips to cover here. One is that spreadsheets will try to steer you away from using CSV. In fact, you can see it right here at the top of the screen here. Possible data loss. Some features might be lost if you save in a CSV format. CSV, it's just a text file. So it can do one tab of data. It can't do formatting like bold and italics. It can't do charts. It can't do formulas that update. It can't gray backgrounds and put borders on things. It can't do any of that thing. That's why the apps are trying to get you to save in their native formats that provide all of that functionality. It's okay. Use CSV. All we care about is the data. Some spreadsheets will often reformat your data, and you got to be a little bit careful about this. So for example, military aircraft often have tail numbers that begin with 00 hyphen and then 4 more digits. That can look an awful lot like a date, and sometimes Excel or other apps will convert that to a date or remove leading zeros, which you don't want. I already talked about hours and minutes. I will read that, but be careful that it gets exported correctly. The spreadsheets will often convert that into a date and a time. I talked a little bit about locale settings. I sniff your browser's preferred language and country, and you can see the blog or the fact for how you can specify that. But if your operating system is using, say, French conventions, and so then your spreadsheet will probably use French conventions. But if your browser is set to English US, then when you upload that data, it will be formatted using French conventions, and that can cause issues because of things like the decimal point or date, month, day, year versus day, month, year. So be aware of that and just make sure that your operating system and your spreadsheet or your browser are using the same format. And finally, saving in text can get into character set issues. So if you're all English, it's no big deal. But if you're using accented characters from some European languages, or you're using entirely different character sets like Hebrew or Kanji or Arabic or Cyrillic, make sure that you're saving your text file in what's called UTF-8 format. Which spreadsheets should do, but sometimes they don't. A good way to check is open it in a text editor, save the file as CSV, and then open it in a text editor. If you can read it, you're good. If you can't, then it didn't save correctly. I talked about how to validate the CSV rows and columns. Some exports don't do that correctly. So, it's using a comma to separate the different columns within a row. Well, what if your data actually includes a comma? Well, then you're supposed to put quotation marks around it. Well, what if your data has quotation marks? There are rules for all of this, but some apps don't follow those rules, and the CSV can be broken. MyFlightbook's pretty good at fixing that up, but it's not perfect. Sometimes you just don't know how to properly fix it up. So you can use that little audit thing I showed to see that. Some third-party programs like CrewTrack use abbreviated names for aliases. So if you're supposed to fly November 45JAA, but the scheduling system just says 45J, then you want to map that to November 45J Alpha Alpha. So what you can do is, in that case, is you can go into the private notes for the aircraft, and so you go aircraft, and you go into the aircraft, go into notes, and if you go into the private notes, if you were to put in, let's say, for this one, if I were to put in pound, alt for alternate, 135 pound, and then save this, click update aircraft. Now, if the tail number were a blank 135, then on import, that would map to November 135 Sierra Sierra. And finally, for airline scheduling, typically those flights are in the future. Some of the formats I know are all about scheduling, and I'll just put them automatically into pending flights. But even if I don't do that, If flights are more than, I think, a day in the future or 2 days in the future, I will put, I treat that as an error, and so you can import that into pending flights. Because of course, you don't want the flight in your logbook until you've actually flown it. That is what I got, and unlike the past 2 weeks, I've actually finished with some time to spare. So with that, let me see, do people have any questions?
I have no question. I just want to say that I just got on this thing yesterday, and it's just unbelievable. Very robust, and actually pretty straightforward as far as uploading everything. And now I just am getting into the bulk editing, and that's why this was very valuable. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. You're welcome. Thank you for the kind words.
We had talked about it offline before, but so there's no way to sync it with like ForeFlight or anything like that, correct?
No. Oh, but you did ask me about, I don't have a good way to show ForeFlight, but what you can do is you can push from ForeFlight the flight track. And if you do that on your app, I might be able to show at least part of how this works. So, well, within ForeFlight, let me see, because I use ForeFlight in the cockpit as well. Although what I generally would do is I run ForeFlight on my iPad and I run MyFlightbook on my iPhone, and I let the iPhone do the recording and the auto detection so that when I land, it's got all the information.
That's a good tip.
But if you go into flights and track logs on ForeFlight, you have to go into the More tab, you go into track logs, tap on the log, and then in the upper right corner, there's a little send icon. It's a little box with an up arrow in it. Here, hold on a second. I can at least show what that screen. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Start video. I wanted to do screen share. There we go. Let me pull up my flight book. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to. So I'm going to run the MyFlightbook app in the emulator here. So this is going to be on a flight-by-flight basis rather than importing your flights at a time, flights plural at a time. Okay, here comes the app. So if you set up the MyFlightbook app to auto detect takeoffs and landings. Here it comes. So you go into settings, and you can, I was gonna say you can do this on Android, but there's no ForeFlight on Android. So you wanna make sure that auto detect takeoffs and landings is turned on and that you have a reasonable takeoff speed. Those are the most important things. And then if you go in ForeFlight, you go to the track log, tap on the log of your flight. There's an icon in the upper right corner that looks like this. It's a square with an up arrow within ForeFlight. If you tap that, there's an option that says open KML in ... And KML is a GPS track format. And if you do that, one of the options should be MyFlightbook, assuming you've got the MyFlightbook app on the same device. Send it to MyFlightbook, and MyFlightbook will ask if you want to initialize a flight based on that KML. And if you do that, if you say yes, it will create a flight and fill in your takeoffs and your landings and your night flight and all of that based on the flight track that ForeFlight sent to it. And then you just put in your remarks and how many approaches you did or things like that, and then you can save it.
I love that feature. I use it all the time. I did have a question related to that, which is it looks like when I do that, it doesn't actually associate the KML with that flight as attached telemetry data?
For that, there's an additional option you have to turn on, which is record flight data.
Aha.
Make
I
sure
knew there was a trick. I knew I was
Yeah.
missing something because it was so obvious.
So auto detect says, just pay attention to the takeoffs and landings and night flight and things like that. But the record flight data is what says, oh yeah, and keep track of it. And so it's treating the KML as if it were real-time, excuse me, as if it were real-time GPS data.
And just to clarify, because if the auto detect creates a flight, and then you import the GPS data from ForeFlight, it's not duplicating or it's not creating a duplicate entry?
It could create a duplicate entry if you do that process twice. But this is a flight-by-flight basis. So you fly on Monday, you do this process on Monday for Monday's flight. Now you go fly on Wednesday, you do that process with Wednesday's flight. You shouldn't get duplicates in that scenario.
If you do it on an individual flight basis, it'll figure out this is the same flight.
Yeah, and this process is only individual flight by individual flight.
Yeah,
the only way to do multiple flights would be to use the ForeFlight logbook, and then you would do the export like I showed here, where you go up to the ForeFlight website and you can export your logbook from there.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you so much.
It looks like those import settings are per app instance, not shared across devices. I think that was part of my confusion.
Yes, they are per app instance. So. Well, I hope everyone's getting to fly.
Just a little. Went for a nice flight yesterday. There's an airport out here in the east that has a nature conservancy right next door. So flew for an hour, went for a 9-mile hike, and then flew back home. It was a nice day.
Oh, how awesome is that?
Hot Springs. I highly recommend it. Hotel Sierra Papa if you're out on the East Coast.
I grew up on the East Coast, but I'm out in Seattle, and we're having some gorgeous, gorgeous weather. And when the weather's nice here, I think there's no prettier place on the planet to fly or to be at all. But my problem is my instrument currency is expiring this month. I need to get them instrument currency, and I don't have the weather for it.
I will agree with you in regards to Seattle. It's where I got my private pilot's license. I live in Germany right now, and I'm resorting to just X-Plane Sim for all this time that I'm putting inside MyFlightbook. So I got about 500 hours in MyFlightbook and very little in actual because I never converted my certificate over to European standards.
Oh, great.
It's definitely been challenging to get to maintain instrument currency with limited opportunities to have a safety pilot.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's been tough for me is like, I don't mind going solo. I can wipe down the plane, but sitting right next to somebody where I don't know who they've been sitting next to, I'm sure they're taking all the right precautions and we can wear masks, but you just don't know what you don't know. So it's at 11 o'clock. I just want to I want to be respectful of people's times. Are there any other questions about importing? Well,
very much for your time. I really appreciate the info.
Yeah, very insightful.
Oh,
thank you.
Are there any topics that people are interested in me covering? Two that I've thought of, but I don't know if they're that interesting are, I have a lot of club functionality on the website. And I don't know if people are at all interested in the admin function, sort of a behind the curtain look at all the admin tools that I have.
Well, as a geek, I'd love to hear about the admin tools.
Yeah, same here. I work in IT and deal with monitoring and databases and other big data functionality in a financial institute. So we definitely have the interest.
Oh, wow.
Another suggestion I'd have as a CFI is sort of, the working with students. And I had a student actually yesterday ask me about who's going to be a private pilot student soon, ask about using electronic logbook and so forth.
I just did last week a webinar on precisely that topic, and I recorded it, and you can find the recording of that up on, if you go, well, it's on YouTube, it's on the YouTube channel. If you go to the website and click on videos in the footer, you'll see that. And in fact, you'll see today's, in probably an hour or two, today's talk will be up there as well.
Great.
I did have a question or thought on, I guess this may be more of a feature request or whatever, but because you were talking about cross country, and I was updating my logbook for forever, and I was on the paper when I was very inaccurate on that. But I guess I'm wondering is, so your system knows if I start at one airport and end at another that was cross country. Does it pre-populate that, or do I still have to click the little gray?
No, I have a whole blog post on that. Cross country is the biggest nightmare because it means exactly one thing except when it doesn't. I encourage you to read my blog post, but the short summary is there's basic cross country, which is, or sometimes called part 135 cross country or 121 cross country, I don't know, but which is where you leave the airport. Don't log cross country time for that. Just if you go from A to B, put A and B in the route field. And if you want to know how much basic cross country time you have, you can do a search. And the terminology I use is non-local flights. And basically, it'll strip out all the flights that are, just have A or A to A. And if you look at your totals, that's your basic cross country time. My second advice is, if whatever is sort of the largest distance that is required for the kinds of ratings you're looking for, so 50 nautical miles for airplanes and 25 for helicopters, log cross-country time only when you exceed that. And that generally works great. Because for a private pilot, the cross-country time you need is 50 nautical miles. Then if you want to, you can log cross-country for more flights than that. And then I have a set of properties that describe whether the cross-country time was less than 25 nautical miles, between 25 nautical miles and 50, or more than 50, or more than 100. And you can use those, and then you can get really granular about how much time do I have, in the 25 to 50 nautical mile range. You don't generally need to do that. And then finally,
I'm sorry, for logging a local flight, then if you're just practicing,
just put the name of the airport, and don't use LCL or local. If you're at KABC, just put KABC in the route field. And
just put it once. Don't put K. Yeah.
You can put KABC. I catch that. Okay. But the same one, and I'll even tell that ABC, KABC is still a local flight. One with the K and one without.
And then if you're, I'm sorry, I'm monopolizing your time here. But if I'm, because sometimes I'll log something as a round trip, so I'll go, from airport A to airport B and then back to airport A. Would your system view that as a local, even though it wasn't? Okay, so
no,
I should
ABA, that's a cross-country flight.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the one other thing is that for the long cross countries in your ratings progress, don't bother putting in the distance, don't bother putting in any of that. Log it as cross-country time, and then I'll do the measurement. So if you have to be 150 nautical miles from your point of departure, or you have to have a leg that is more than whatever, I measure all of that. Don't overthink it. There's one pilot who's been pestering me to help log the do a bulk update where it fills in the distance flown field, which I have to figure out a good way to do. It's not hard to compute. It's just hard to sort of figure out where in the UI to put that. And yeah, it's really unnecessary, because in the system, I compute that distance. If you just click on the route, I'll tell you what the distance was. So if you log the flight and click on the route, I tell you exactly what your longest straight line distance was, what your furthest distance from your starting airport was, and what your total flight path was.
Thank you.
All right. Well, maybe I'll put, and I see Dan has actually joined, unfortunately, just as we're finishing.
I did.
So,
I was here before, quietly.
Oh, okay. So with that, maybe next week I will do a behind the curtain admin call. But otherwise, I hope everyone is staying safe and flying safe and flying. Let me know if you have any other thoughts for things that might be good webinars.
Great.
Thanks so much.
very much.
Okay,
Appreciate your
thank you
time.
very much.
Thank you very
Derek.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.